I'm Billy Fenning. I'm the senior leader here at All Nations, and here is my thought for the week. This coming Sunday, we start a new series as a church looking at the book of Ephesians. The book of Ephesians is an amazing book. It talks about our position as believers, really heaven coming to earth in our lives. And Paul talks about our identity and our calling, how we've been called from darkness into light. And I hope you will be able to join us on Sunday mornings and in our home groups during the week, because we will be just looking at Ephesians in greater detail, in greater depth. But I hope that you will be encouraged as we go through this book, right through to Easter, looking at this wonderful epistle. And Paul reminds us that God has blessed us with every spiritual blessing in heavenly places in Christ. And in those first few verses in chapter 1, Paul reminds us of our position in Christ, our wealth in Christ, how we are rich in Christ. We have been blessed, but we have been blessed because the blessings flow from the cross of Jesus. And he talks about the fact that we've been blessed with him in heavenly places. Right through this epistle, we hear that phrase, heavenly places, because later on in chapter 2, Paul talks about the fact that grace has been, we have experienced something of the grace of God, and because of his grace we are saved, but we've been raised up together and made to sit with Christ, where in heavenly places. Amazing book. So it's important, if we're going to fulfill our destiny and purpose in God, that we understand our identity. And this book is all about our identity, that we are adopted into his family, that we sit with Christ in heavenly places. What an amazing chapter. Amazing few verses. It just keeps rolling. We're accepted in Christ. We are chosen in him before the foundation of the world. We have been adopted into the family of God. We have been redeemed. We have been forgiven. And it goes on. And the phrase that Paul uses over and over in chapter 1 is according to the good pleasure of his will, according to the riches of his grace, according to his good pleasure which he purposed in himself. So often we think of salvation just about our aspect and what we receive in terms of our forgiveness and our standing before God. But we need to understand about God's purpose, how God delights in his purpose for us. And so I hope that as we go through these chapters that you will be enriched in your Christian journey and your experience with God. And so from those first few chapters, or those first few verses in Ephesians, Paul goes on to pray. He prays that we would have an understanding, that God would give us a revelation, that we would be enlightened, that our hearts would come to know, not just our intellect and our minds, but our hearts. That the Spirit of God would touch our heart, that we would have a revelation of who we are and what God has done in our lives. And he prays that we would know the hope of his calling, the invitation that God has given to you and I, calling us from darkness into light. And later on in chapter 5, Paul talks about the fact that we are to walk in light because we are children of light. He said that we once were darkness, but now we are the light in the Lord. Walk as children of the light. And Paul takes up the theme, not only the wealth that we have, and that he prays that we would have an understanding of this wealth, but he takes up the theme, the practical section of the letter, that we walk. Our behavior, our whole journey of life, how we walk before God. And so because we've been called into light, we are children of light, Paul says, therefore walk in the light. And from chapter 4, he takes up this whole theme of walking, how we walk worthy of our calling. If God has called you, I pray that in 2021 we will walk worthy of our calling before God. So I hope you will join us in the weeks to come as we look at this wonderful book. God bless you.